A cop arrests a black doctor. He's stunned by the consequences. Officer Jack Donovan was known around town for being a no-nonsense cop. He had served the police force for over 15 years and was known for his strict adherence to the law. Jack always believed that rules were made to be followed, and he didn't take kindly to anyone who bent them. His stern gaze and rigid posture often intimidated people, and it was no surprise that he rarely smiled. Jack took pride in keeping the streets safe, and in his mind, there was little room for second chances or excuses. Dr. Marcus Reed, on the other hand, was a well-respected figure in the same community. A brilliant surgeon in his late 40s, Marcus had worked hard to build a reputation as one of the best doctors in the region. He was admired not only for his skills but for his kindness and dedication to helping others. Marcus came from humble beginnings, but his intelligence and determination led him to excel in the medical field. His patients adored him, and his colleagues respected him deeply. One evening, as Marcus was driving home from the hospital after a long shift, he was pulled over by Officer Donovan. The streets were quiet, and Marcus couldn't understand why he was being stopped. He had been careful not to speed and had made sure to follow all the traffic rules. As he pulled his car to the side of the road, he took a deep breath and rolled down his window. "License and registration?" Jack demanded, his tone cold and official. Marcus handed over his documents without question, assuming this was just a routine check. But as Jack looked at Marcus's license, something changed in his demeanor. The cop's eyes narrowed, and he began asking questions in a harsher tone. "Where are you coming from?" Jack asked, glancing suspiciously at the back seat of the car. "From the hospital," Marcus replied calmly. "I'm a doctor. I've just finished my shift." Jack's gaze didn't soften. In fact, it seemed to harden even more. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Confused, Marcus did as he was told. His mind raced. What could possibly be the problem? He had done nothing wrong. But before he could ask, Jack began frisking him, searching for something that wasn't there. Passers-by started to glance over, noticing the tension building on the quiet street. "What's going on?" Marcus finally asked, his voice steady but firm. Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he cuffed Marcus, his movements quick and forceful. "You're under arrest," he said flatly. "For what?" Marcus asked, genuinely bewildered. Jack's face was unreadable. "We'll sort that out at the station," he muttered, pulling Marcus towards the patrol car. In that moment, Marcus felt a mixture of confusion and humiliation. Here he was, a man who had dedicated his life to saving others, being treated like a common criminal. As he sat in the back of the police car, Marcus couldn't help but wonder how things had escalated so quickly, and why. As Officer Jack Donovan drove toward the station with Dr. Marcus Reed sitting silently in the back seat, tension hung heavy in the air. Marcus stared out of the window, trying to make sense of what was happening. He wasn't a stranger to the occasional misunderstanding, but this felt different. This felt wrong. Jack, on the other hand, felt certain he was doing his job. His instincts had never let him down before, and something about Marcus just didn't sit right with him. Jack had grown up in a community where people like Marcus didn't often make it far. To him, it seemed odd that someone who looked like Marcus, driving an expensive car, dressed in nice clothes, could be anything other than trouble. As they arrived at the station, Jack led Marcus inside without a word. Marcus' heart was pounding in his chest, not out of fear but out of frustration. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. The indignity of being handcuffed, of being judged based on appearance alone, was infuriating. "Sit here," Jack ordered, pushing Marcus into a chair in the small interrogation room. Marcus complied, his mind still racing. He knew that arguing or getting angry wouldn't help his case. He had to keep calm, though it was becoming increasingly difficult. What exactly was Jack accusing him of? Why had this situation escalated so quickly? Minutes passed before Jack finally spoke again. "Tell me what you were really doing tonight," he said, leaning against the table, arms crossed, staring at Marcus as if he already knew the answer. Marcus looked up, trying to keep his voice even. "I told you, I was driving home from the hospital. I'm a doctor. I work there." "Sure you are," Jack scoffed. His tone was filled with doubt, as if Marcus' words were too good to be true. "A doctor, driving a car like that in this neighborhood? Something doesn't add up." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to control the growing frustration. Yes, I am a doctor. I've worked at the hospital for over 10 years. I don't know what you think I've done, but this is a mistake. But Jack wasn't listening. His mind was already made up. Years of policing in tough neighborhoods had hardened him. He believed he knew how to spot trouble, and to him, Marcus was fitting the profile. In Jack's eyes, Marcus wasn't just a doctor, he was someone pretending to be one. I've heard that story before, Jack said with a smirk, his arms still crossed. Nice clothes, fancy car. It all looks legit on the surface. But that's the thing with people like you. You're always hiding something. The words hit Marcus like a punch in the gut. People like you. He had heard those words before, usually from people who didn't know him, people who judged him based on his skin color or where he was from, rather than his character or achievements. But hearing them from a police officer, someone sworn to protect and serve, made it sting even more. I'm not hiding anything, Marcus replied, his voice tightening with anger. Check my records. Call the hospital. You'll see I'm telling the truth. But Jack shook his head, convinced that this was just a cover-up. He wasn't about to let Marcus off so easily. As far as he was concerned, Marcus was just another guy trying to game the system, and Jack had seen it too many times before to fall for it now. Jack left the room, leaving Marcus alone for what felt like hours. As Marcus sat there, his frustration grew. He thought about his family, his wife, his young son, waiting for him at home, probably wondering why he hadn't returned yet. He thought about his patients, the surgeries he had lined up for the next day. All of it was being put at risk because of this baseless arrest. Meanwhile, Jack was in the back office, discussing the situation with his fellow officers. Most of them didn't know Marcus personally, but a few had heard his name from the community. Jack's sergeant, Officer Daniels, walked over and raised an eyebrow. Donovan, you sure about this guy? Daniels asked. That name sounds familiar. I think he's actually a doctor. Jack shrugged. Maybe, but something's off about him. I don't trust it. Daniels frowned. We don't want any trouble here. If he's clean, we have to let him go. Jack waved him off. Don't worry, Sarge. I'm just being thorough. Something will come up, I'm sure of it. But nothing came up. Hours passed, and the deeper Jack dug into Marcus' background, the clearer it became that Marcus was exactly who he said he was. A respected doctor with a spotless record. No criminal history, no shady dealings, nothing to suggest he had done anything wrong. Still, Jack wasn't ready to admit he had made a mistake. Back in the interrogation room, Marcus was beginning to lose his patience. He had remained calm for hours, but the situation was wearing on him. His phone had been taken, so he couldn't contact his family or his lawyer. He felt powerless. Finally, Jack returned, his expression still hard, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had nothing on Marcus, but his pride wouldn't let him back down easily. Looks like you're clean, Jack muttered, sitting across from Marcus. For now. Marcus stared at him, disbelief flashing across his face. For now? You arrested me for nothing. You've wasted my time, damaged my reputation, and for what? Jack leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. Like I said, I was just being thorough. You can never be too careful. The casual way Jack dismissed the whole ordeal infuriated Marcus. His life had been turned upside down for no reason other than Jack's baseless suspicions. And now, Jack wasn't even offering an apology. You don't even care, do you? Marcus said, his voice rising. You don't care that you've wrongfully arrested me, humiliated me. You just think you're always right, no matter the consequences? Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. In his mind, he had followed protocol, done his duty. He didn't see why Marcus was making such a big deal out of it. I'm done with this, Marcus said, standing up. I'm leaving, and you'll be hearing from my lawyer. With that, Marcus walked out, leaving Jack sitting in the room, his pride wounded but still intact. Jack watched him go, convinced that he had done nothing wrong. But as Marcus drove home, the weight of what had happened settled on him. This wasn't just about one bad cop making a mistake. It was about the deeper issue of being judged unfairly because of his skin color. Marcus had worked his entire life to prove himself, to be respected for his talents and abilities, But moments like this reminded him that in the eyes of some, he would always be reduced to a stereotype. When he arrived home, his wife, Rachel, was waiting for him, her eyes filled with worry. "What happened?" she asked, rushing to his side. Marcus took a deep breath, shaking his head. "I was arrested. For nothing. Jack Donovan pulled me over, assumed I was up to no good, and took me in." Rachel's face twisted with anger and disbelief. "How could this happen?" "I don't know," Marcus said, sinking onto the couch. "But I'm not letting it go. I've worked too hard to be treated like this." Rachel sat beside him, taking his hand. "We'll fight it. Whatever it takes, we'll fight it." Meanwhile, back at the station, Jack went about his business as usual, not realizing the storm that was about to come his way. In his mind, he had done his job. Marcus was just another guy who had gotten off because he hadn't been caught yet. But the next morning, as Jack sat down at his desk, he noticed something unusual. His inbox was flooded with emails, and his phone was ringing off the hook. As he answered the first call, a familiar voice greeted him. "Officer Donovan, this is Attorney Franklin. I represent Dr. Marcus Reed. You're going to want to hear this." Jack's stomach sank. In the days following Marcus Reed's wrongful arrest, the situation began to spiral in ways Officer Jack Donovan never could have imagined. Marcus had reached out to his lawyer, but that was just the beginning. News of the arrest started to spread, and as the details emerged, it became clear this was no ordinary case. At first, Jack carried on with his duties as if nothing had happened. He had no idea the storm that was brewing. The department hadn't reprimanded him yet, and his fellow officers had mostly shrugged it off. Jack believed it was just another incident that would blow over. But Marcus wasn't going to let it go. His life had been disrupted, his dignity assaulted, and now he was determined to fight back. Marcus wasn't just any doctor. He was a well-respected figure in the community, with deep ties to influential people. The hospital he worked at wasn't just any hospital either. It was one of the largest and most prestigious medical centers in the city. His colleagues included some of the most renowned doctors and surgeons, many of whom were highly connected. What Jack didn't realize was that Marcus wasn't going to fight this battle alone. The first sign of trouble came when a local news station picked up the story. Marcus had decided to share his experience with the press, not out of revenge but to raise awareness about the injustice he had faced. A well-spoken and calm man, Marcus gave an interview that quickly caught the public's attention. He described what had happened in clear, measured words, explaining how he had been wrongfully arrested based on nothing more than an assumption. He spoke about the wider issues of racial profiling and systemic bias in law enforcement, highlighting how his experience was part of a much bigger problem. Viewers were captivated by Marcus' story. He wasn't angry or vengeful. He was simply a man who had been wronged, trying to make sure it didn't happen to others. His story struck a chord, and soon it wasn't just local news covering the story. National media outlets began to take notice. The incident became a flashpoint in the ongoing discussion about race and justice in America. Marcus' calm but powerful words gave the story even more weight, and suddenly, Jack Donovan found himself at the center of a growing controversy. Jack noticed the shift almost immediately. The first time someone recognized him in public, it caught him off guard. He was walking into a coffee shop when a man gave him a sharp look and muttered under his breath. Jack couldn't make out the words, but the hostility was clear. Then, as he walked down the street later that day, someone shouted from across the road, "Hey, Donovan, how does it feel to ruin an innocent man's life?" Jack kept his head down and walked faster, trying to ignore the growing tension. But things were just beginning to unravel. Back at the station, Jack started noticing the stares from his colleagues. At first, it was subtle, quiet whispers as he walked by, quick glances in his direction. But it didn't take long for the murmurs to turn into full-blown conversations behind his back. Jack had always been a well-respected officer, but now, people were starting to question him. His arrest of Marcus was being scrutinized by the department, and though no one had confronted him directly, the weight of their judgment was palpable. Jack's superiors called him into a meeting one afternoon. Seated across from him were the police chief and a few other high-ranking officers. They weren't happy. "We've got a problem, Donovan," the chief said, his tone sharp. "This arrest you made, it's blowing up in our faces. The media's all over it and people are asking questions. You need to be prepared for what's coming. Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I was just doing my job. The guy looked suspicious. I had reason to believe. That's not the point, the chief interrupted, frustration clear in his voice. You arrested a well-known doctor with no evidence, and now it's turning into a PR nightmare. We're getting pressure from the city, from the mayor's office, from activists. They want answers. Jack opened his mouth to respond, but the chief cut him off again. You need to lay low for a while. We're putting you on administrative leave until this blows over. Administrative leave? The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He had never been put on leave before, never had his decisions questioned in this way. It felt like a betrayal. He had spent years working his way up in the department, building a reputation as a tough but fair cop. Now, it was all falling apart because of one arrest. Jack went home that night, his mind racing. He tried to convince himself that it would all blow over, that the department would clear him and everything would go back to normal. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The situation was far worse than he wanted to admit. Meanwhile, Marcus was gaining more support than he had ever imagined. His story had resonated with people across the country, and soon, prominent figures in the community were speaking out on his behalf. Lawyers, civil rights activists, and even celebrities began to publicly condemn the arrest. Social media was flooded with messages of support for Marcus, and calls for justice echoed throughout the city. Marcus had never sought the spotlight, but now that it was on him, he used it to bring attention to the broader issue of racial profiling. He didn't focus solely on his own experience, but spoke about the countless other people who had been wrongfully arrested or mistreated by law enforcement. His calm demeanor and thoughtful approach won him even more allies, and soon he was being invited to speak at events and rallies. But while Marcus' public profile was rising, Jack's world was crumbling. The media was relentless in their coverage, and Jack became a target of public outrage. People began digging into his past, looking for any other questionable actions he had taken as an officer. Old complaints that had been swept under the rug resurfaced, and Jack's reputation took a nosedive. One evening, as Jack sat at home watching the news, he saw a segment featuring Marcus. The doctor was speaking at a community event, surrounded by supporters, his voice calm and confident as he addressed the crowd. I didn't expect this to happen to me, Marcus said, his voice carrying through the television. But it did. And it's happened to many others who didn't have the platform or the resources to fight back. This isn't just about me, it's about a system that needs to change. Jack felt a knot form in his stomach as he watched. Marcus' words were cutting through all the noise, and people were listening. For the first time, Jack started to realize the gravity of what he had done. This wasn't going to just go away. It was bigger than him now. The lawsuit came next. Marcus, with the backing of a top civil rights lawyer, filed a suit against the city and the police department for wrongful arrest and racial discrimination. The legal team was fierce, and they weren't just aiming for a settlement, they wanted accountability. They wanted Jack to face consequences for his actions. The lawsuit made headlines, and Jack found himself in the crosshairs of not just public opinion but the legal system as well. His savings were drained as he tried to fight the case, but it was clear that Marcus' team had the upper hand. They had evidence, public support, and a compelling narrative on their side. Jack's colleagues at the department distanced themselves from him. The same officers who had once backed him up in tough situations were now avoiding him. Some even openly criticized him, saying that he had acted recklessly and brought shame to the department. Jack felt isolated, abandoned by the very people he had worked alongside for years. As the trial date approached, Jack's stress levels reached an all-time high. He barely slept, his mind constantly racing with thoughts of what could happen. He knew that his career was on the line, but more than that, his entire life was at risk of being destroyed. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, activists, and members of the community filled the seats, all waiting to see how the case would unfold. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table, his lawyer by his side, while Jack sat with his own legal team, feeling the weight of the room pressing down on him. The trial was grueling. Marcus' lawyer presented a clear and damning case, showing how Jack had racially profiled Marcus, arrested him without cause, and violated his rights. They brought in witnesses who testified to Marcus' character, his contributions to the community, and the damage the arrest had done to his reputation. Jack's lawyer tried to defend his actions, arguing that he had been following procedure and that the arrest was a misunderstanding. But the jury wasn't buying it. The evidence was too strong, and Marcus' story was too powerful. In the end, the verdict came down swiftly. The jury ruled in favor of Marcus, awarding him a substantial sum in damages and holding Jack accountable for his actions. The courtroom erupted in cheers as the decision was announced, while Jack sat in stunned silence. But the consequences didn't end there. The department, eager to distance itself from the scandal, fired Jack. His career as a police officer was over. No longer the respected enforcer of the law, Jack found himself on the other side of it, facing the full weight of the consequences for his actions. Marcus, meanwhile, returned to his life, forever changed by the experience but stronger for it. He continued to work as a doctor, but now with a renewed sense of purpose. He had fought back against injustice and won, and he knew that his story had helped bring attention to an issue that affected countless others. For Jack, the fallout was devastating. His name had been dragged through the mud, his career was over, and he was left with nothing but the bitter realization that his actions had led to his own downfall. He had lost everything: his job, his reputation, and the respect of his peers. And in the end, he had no one to blame but himself. The twist was clear. In trying to assert his authority and power over Marcus, Jack had only succeeded in destroying his own life. The karma of his actions had come back to haunt him, leaving him with nothing but regret. As the dust settled after the trial, both Officer Jack Donovan and Dr. Marcus Reed were left with their own reflections. For Jack, the reality of his actions finally sank in. He had spent years thinking he was simply enforcing the law, but deep down, he knew there had been something more. His bias, whether he had realized it or not, had clouded his judgment that day when he arrested Marcus. Now, the consequences of that moment would follow him for the rest of his life. Jack was left with a life he barely recognized. No badge, no career, and no respect from the community he had once served. Every day, he replayed the arrest in his head, how differently it could have gone if he had taken a moment to ask questions instead of assuming the worst. The weight of his actions was heavy, and he couldn't escape the knowledge that he had ruined not only Marcus' day but also his own future. But despite all of this, Jack couldn't shake the memory of Marcus. How, even after everything, Marcus had never lashed out in anger or tried to humiliate him. Instead, Marcus had responded with dignity and a quiet strength. It was that grace that stayed with Jack. In the end, Jack wasn't just punished by the court. He was punished by the realization of his own failure to see the humanity in someone like Marcus. On the other side of it all, Marcus was slowly rebuilding his life. The scars of that day would never fully fade, but he had emerged stronger, knowing he had stood up not just for himself but for countless others who had faced the same injustice. The media attention had been overwhelming at times, but Marcus never lost sight of his goal: to shine a light on racial profiling and make sure people like Jack were held accountable for their actions. Marcus had no interest in revenge or making Jack suffer. Instead, he hoped that this experience would change Jack. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but eventually. Maybe one day Jack would come to understand the harm he had caused, not just to Marcus, but to the wider community. That was the real victory for Marcus. Not the lawsuit, not the public support, but the hope that change was possible, even for someone like Jack. Both men had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths. For Jack, it was the realization that his actions had consequences far beyond his own understanding. For Marcus, it was the knowledge that, even in the face of injustice, he could stand tall and fight back with grace. The story ends with a simple truth: prejudice and injustice cannot win in the long run. People like Marcus, with their resilience and determination, will always rise above, while those like Jack, who allow bias to guide their actions, will ultimately face the consequences of their choices. This wasn't just about one cop and one doctor. It was a reflection of a much larger issue in society. In the quiet moments after the trial, both men reflected on what had happened. Marcus continued his work, more determined than ever to help others, while Jack was left to rebuild, knowing that his past would forever shape his future. The moral was clear: justice, though it may take time, will always find its way.